Good afternoon. The time's now 2 o'clock and it's time to resume the inquiry. Mr. Boyle, your witness.
Thank you very much. Madam, can I just ask, are you working generally from electronic or paper copies?
Generally electronic.
And what about the proofs themselves?
I have the proofs of evidence in front of me and open, so I can, which is probably why you see me scanning side to side, because I've got some on one screen and others on another.
Okay. And Mr. Dudley, what about you? Are you mostly paper or mostly electronic?
I have paper copies of most of the key documents in front of me, but I also have a computer next to me that has everything on. So I'm happy to be at your disposal.
Helpful. As you know from other times, you and I have been doing this exercise with Dudley. I tend to like to have lots of documents out in front of me. We can look at them all at the same time. But obviously, what I need to do is to make sure the inspector's got her images up and dotting between them. Madam, I reviewed matters over lunch. I don't think there's any document outside the proofs and appendices that we're going to need to go to.
Okay, thank you.
I don't absolutely guarantee that, because we might need to dip into the MPPF. But in terms of evidential documents, I think will be contained within the proofs and appendices. So you should have, I hope, Mr. Dudley's proof, which in my version has appendices bound into the back of it.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
In addition to that, you'll have Mr. Cook's proof of evidence, and then he's got 2 volume appendices, one A4 and then part 2 A3.
Right, I'll just open those if you just bear with me. Sorry, which number appendices did you want?
It's part 1 and part 2. They're 2 volumes because in real format, one is published at A4 and the other at A3.
I've access to both of those, so when the time comes.
And I think that's probably all we'll need. Mr. Dudley, have you got those to hand?
Yes, I do.
Right, okay, well, let's get cracking in that case. Ms. Dudley, can I just take you first of all to the beginning of your proof, where you helpfully set out the reason for refusal that you speak to?
Yes.
Thank you. And I appreciate you're not a planner. We've got planning evidence hereafter. I'm not going to ask you specifically about the policies which are there set out, but I want to just identify what the allegations of the authority are. It's right to say, isn't it, that you came on scene after the appeal was lodged, and therefore by definition after the application was refused?
That's correct.
And so the reason that we see set out at your paragraph 2.8, you turn that up?
Yes.
Page 7, 2.8. That wasn't formulated with the benefit of any contribution from you?
No, that's right. As I understand it, it would have been based on the contribution from the council's own landscape officer. That's
very helpful. And obviously, we know the position of the planning officers in terms of their recommendation, don't we?
We do.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the allegations, it is nonetheless those allegations in that reason that your evidence is directed to.
Yes.
And you'll appreciate your role in this exercise. You may have all sorts of interesting reasons for having a landscape objection to the scheme, but as is relevant to the authority's case, it's what's contained within the reason for refusal that matters.
Yes.
Yes, that's very helpful. Also, just for clarity, I don't think you do depart from this in any way. Were there any part of the reason for refusal you didn't that you didn't agree with, then professionally, of course, you would need to indicate that to the inspector and say you don't support that point.
Yes.
Good. Helpful. Now let's just look at the reason. It's set out at the bottom of page 7. And we can see, can't we, that the allegation falls into 2 parts. The first concerns the significant impact on the setting of the village of Overton, adversely impacting local landscape character and scenic quality. Yeah?
Yes.
If I call that the character point. Yeah?
Yes.
And then the second, in the next sentence, wouldn't successfully integrate surrounding development, resulting significant adverse impacts on visual quality. I'm going to call that the visual point. Yeah.
Yes.
Now, we know obviously character and visual have a relationship. I'm sorry, this is all well-tried stuff, Mr. Dudley, you and I have a relationship between each other, but in terms of analysis and the way Glivia approaches the exercise, both you and Mr. Cook recognize they're two separate exercises to look at landscape character impacts and to look at landscape visual impacts.
That's right.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And although you touch on residential visual impact, you do not, do you, embraced by that residential amenity, which is for a planner, as opposed to a landscape architect?
No, that's right. I simply consider the views that would be experienced from the existing private dwellings that look across the site.
As visual receptors, as opposed to a residential amenity point.
That's right. I'm not looking at the wider residential amenity simply from a visual impact assessment point of view.
I'm very grateful. So there we have the distinctions in the reason for refusal, landscape character point we'll explore in a moment, and then the visual impact point as a separate exercise. And that's reflected, isn't it, in the structure of your proof and the working through of the Livia methodology that's at the back of your appendices.
That's right.
Good. Excellent. Thank you. Don't put your proof too far away. I just want to get ourselves some orientation next, please. Can I take up with you the A3 appendices, which are attached to Mr. Cook's evidence?
Okay, what is the appendix number, please?
Well, it's called Part 2.
Part 2, yes. Okay.
It starts, in my version, it starts at Appendix 11 and runs through to Appendix 25, but the volume is called Part 2.
Sorry, I've opened the contents page rather than Part 2. I'm running down the electronic list now.
Is this not one of the documents you have in hard copy?
Let me check. One moment, please.
I think it would be much easier if we both looked at the hard copy.
I think I only have the original submissions in hard copy, unfortunately. I don't think I have Mr. Cook's. I'm afraid I haven't printed those.
You mean the evidence? You don't have Mr. Cook's evidence in hard copy?
Yeah, I have Mr. Cook's proof, but not Mr. Cook's A3 appendices in hard copy. Okay. So I'm just scrolling down the list of submitted information.
Perhaps, Mr. Boyd, if you could tell us which ones you want us to open.
By all means, madam. I'm going to start with Appendix 11, 12.
Oh, yes, I have those.
You got those?
I do, yes. Sorry, I hadn't realized in the electronic submission they'd been exploded into their individual appendix numbers. Apologies for that. Yes, I have all of those.
I have to confess, I've never looked at the electronic versions. I couldn't tell you. Madam, in truth, it's all of those appendices apart from the ZTVs at the end. So it's 11 through to 22, and within 22, obviously, there's a series of individual sheets we'll have to look at. And I don't know how one bookmarks these things, but I'll try and identify which we're likely to come back to frequently.
Well, don't worry, they're all opened in sequence across the top and tabs, so I can get to them relatively quickly.
Thank you very much. Are you there, Mr. Dudley?
I am.
Great. Let's start at the beginning with the parameters plan. You appreciate this is an outline scheme. So the development proposals are themselves illustrative, but one of the plans for approval you find, I hope, at Appendix 11, the parameters plan.
That's right. Yes, I do.
And that shows in orange or yellow the development area, parcels, and in green the public open space and general amenity space. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And then there's two scales of wiggly green lines around the outside, which indicate hedgerow and tree belt reinforcement planting.
Yes.
And you should also have, I hope, a pink indication of the RPAs.
Yes.
As much as anything else for future information. And you appreciate that the process by which the inspector would go through would be to bind this parameters plan in by way of conditions. So the reserve matters then would need to conform materially with the layout and parameters plan.
Yes.
That's very helpful. And we can see from that, I don't know if you have I didn't ask you to turn it up for fear of opening too many documents. Mr. Cook's proof gives us, as it were, a land budget as a result of that parameters plan. It's his page 27 for anyone with the hard copy. His page 27. And
my
what he
hard
tells
copy
us,
isn't paginated. What was the paragraph number, please, Mr. Boyle?
439 and 440.
Sorry, I was looking at his landscape and visual impact assessment. That will explain it. Yes,
Right.
I have that
so
there.
His proof 439 and 440. That gives us what I call a land budget. There's the orange bit, 3.14 hectares of the 9.4 total site, and so the balance is 6.25 hectares of the site undeveloped for housing.
Yes.
Yeah. And the heading below that also gives us the density. The density that we're looking at for 75 dwellings, given that area, is 23.9 dwellings DPH.
Yes.
Yeah, that's helpful. And the next stage of working up that process, obviously, is the reserve matters, but that has been illustrated. If you go to Appendix 12, so Mr. Cook's Appendix 12. Now, in my version, I've got a lovely A1 pull-out sheet. It looks like that.
Yes, I have it electronically.
I'm grateful. It's based on an aerial photograph. You have that?
I do.
And this, remembering status, is illustrative, but it's provided to inform the decision maker and assist the decision maker, now our inspector, of course. What we see there, I hope you can see correctly, called 7 acres.
Yes.
Which has been superimposed because obviously it wasn't on the aerial photograph. And then next to it, the 2 development parcels we've just seen in Appendix 11.
Yes.
Yeah, worked up in terms of their layouts, including gardens and roads and so on, illustratively, necessarily. But also in addition to that, we can see the planting areas previously shown as little green squiggles or big green squiggles in rather more indicative detail.
Yes.
And so just again, so we get our orientation, if you have the plan say that it sits in portrait version with the text at the bottom, the southern boundary, you can see the area of additional planting vis-a-vis the southern boundary.
Yes.
You got that? There's then the additional planting on the, I'm going to call it the western boundary. So it's one of your sunken lanes.
Yes.
Yeah. And orchard planting. And then open grassland in the northern half of the site with the smaller lobe of development near Pond Close. You've got that?
Yes.
And then again, additional planting in the geographically, it's the top. Physically, it's the bottom of the
Yes.
site. You know what
I understand.
Because of the way the land slopes. But the northern end of the site, as the land slopes down towards the settlement at that end, and again, another of the sunken lanes running along the northern boundary.
Yes.
That's very helpful. And I'd say, although this matter obviously gets dealt with at reserve matter stage, the illustrative plan is, as I understand it, together with the parameters plan, the way in which both parties have sought to assess the likely impact of this scheme in landscape and visual terms.
I focused on the submitted detail for consideration, which is the parameter plan. So yes. There's no commitment or guarantee that what's shown here will be delivered. It's as I understand it, it's an illustration of how the landscape elements as established within the parameter plan could be delivered on site to seek a positive solution.
That's very fair. And there's no suggestion from you or the council that what's shown in this scheme couldn't be delivered.
No, that's right.
Yeah, that's good. Now that's helpful because what I want to do, if I may, is to ask you and the inspector to keep the illustrative plan available on the screen, because I'm going to be referring to it at different stages, having established its status. But when we see what is there shown, and as in particular we see the layout configuration of the adjacent 7 acres, I go to your proof, if I may, and it's a point which arises within the character section. So it's your section 4, and it's at your paragraph 438. Would you mind just turning that up for me?
Sorry, 438.
I'm so sorry. I'll do that over and over again. I'll also not call you Mr. Dudley at various points. 436.
436. Okay.
436.
Yes, I have 436.
And in my version, it crosses over the page to page 26.
Yes.
And at the top of page 26, you say the development, and the context being, as I understand it there, that means the built development. Yeah. The
Yes.
built development is not likely to be out of keeping with the existing village, especially given the adjacent site we now can say completed, and that's 7 acres.
Yes.
Yeah? So the built development is not likely to be out of keeping with the existing village, especially given the adjacent now completed 7 acre site, and there is potential to improve the appearance of the village in this location. Yeah, and then you have your caveat.
Yes, that's right. It's yeah, I think it was a reasonable, balanced view, given that it's the same developer developing both areas, that they would deliver to a similar character.
That's
and there has been harm identified with an unsympathetic approach undertaken in the early 60s with the delivery of Polson's Close in those areas, which would be obscured by certain parts of the master plan development.
Good. Well, that's very fair, Mr. Dudley, and the inspector can proceed on that common basis that the proposed built development, we both agree, is not likely to be out of keeping with the existing village, especially given the adjacent 7 acres, and there's potential to improve the appearance of the village in this location. Now, with that in mind, you can put your proof to one side for a moment, go back to the appendices of Mr. Cook's evidence, the Part 2 appendix. And again, I just want to get some orientation for questions hereafter. If you go to, it must be Appendix 13 now, which is the rights of way plan.
Yes.
We can see here, I'm going to refer to the Sunken Lanes, first of all. There's one I've mentioned that runs along the north of the site, and on the aerial photograph, you can see the trees that, as it were, overshadow. You've walked these, and the inspector will walk them in due course. The trees that embower the Sunken Lane as it runs to the north of the site, near where the word Overton 11 is written.
Yes.
Got that? That's one Sunken Lane. The other Sunken Lane of interest to you is the one that runs down the west of the site. I've just identified from the aerial photograph near to where the orchard planting is going to be. And that runs along the side of the site, apart from the old, was it a gravel pit or something?
Yeah, in fairness, where orchard planting is illustrated, there's no commitment to orchard planting. But yes.
Can I make it clear, Mr. Dudley, that's implicit now for hereafter. We've established, I hope, between us, we both understand what an illustrative plan means. And
yes,
you've accepted that it can be delivered. I accept it need not be delivered. It's a matter for reserve matters.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah, that's helpful. And so we've got the north-south, as it were, lane, Sunken Lane, which then heads off to what becomes Overton 26, which is a bridleway.
Yes.
So those are the two sunken lanes adjacent to the site.
Yes.
Yeah. In addition, while we're looking at this plan, we've got what's called Overton 502. Yeah.
Yes.
Now that links with the sunken lane to the northern side, but it itself is what we Cumbrians have called a loning. It's the access track, isn't it, to Turrell Hill Farm?
Yes.
And so it's a tarmac track, but it's not a public. It's not a road. It's not a boat. At that part where it says Overton 502, it is a footpath. There is a public right of way along it.
That's correct.
Yeah, but not in terms of vehicular access. Ironically, there is vehicular access if one could make it on the boat, which is a sunken lane that becomes then later on a bridleway at Overton 26.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. So those are the two sunken lanes, and then I don't know what we want to call Overton 502. It's not Turrell Hill Lane, is it? Because that's one of the sunken lanes. Can we call it Turrell Hill Track?
It does have a name. Just one moment. Sorry. Does it? No, possibly it doesn't. So yes, shall we call it the farm track for?
Let's call it the farm track
for the sake of common terminology.
That's helpful. Farm track. That's very helpful indeed. Now, I can then ask you, please, to move on in the appendices to, it must be Appendix 11. No, sorry, Appendix 16. And it's the environmental designations plan.
Yes.
That's very
sorry, 16. Yeah, 15. Okay.
Appendix 15.
Yes.
Yeah. And I simply go here to identify where the AONB is.
Yes, it's the southern boundary of the AONB aligns with the railway line, which runs on the lower northern slopes of the Test Valley.
That's very helpful. So we can see that the inspector sees where the AONB is. The appeal site is shown in its entirety in red, and we can see the village of Overton and the valley bottom, and then the valley rises up the far side. You can see the contour lines, meets the railway, and it's beyond the railway we find the AONB.
Yes, that's correct.
Good, thank you. The next plan, just going in sequence, shows both national and county character areas. And I just want to look, please, at the national, which is in the square box of that plan, where the division is between the Thames Basin Heaths and Hampshire Downs.
Yes.
You see that? And we're obviously within the Hampshire Downs, south of that line. Yeah?
Yes.
And if you look then at the more local level, the county level, you can see, I hope, the green notation. Landscape character type is downland mosaic, large scale.
Yes.
You see that? And you can see obviously the different notations on the other side of the valley. And then there's a black line. Do you have that?
I do.
Where we straddle, as I understand it, 7B and 3B.
That's right. Yes, this is also set out in my proof, paragraphs 3.8 to 3.17 for the inspector's benefit.
Thank you. Now, just pausing there. If you have Mr. Mr. Cook's appendix within the Part 1 volume, and it's Appendix 1, I hope you find, which is the Hampshire Downs National Character Area Profile.
Yes.
You have that?
I do.
And again, if you still have the master plan open, or for my purposes, the parameter plan, I don't mind. It's right, isn't it? If we go to page 16, of the national character area profile for Hampshire Downs, we should find SEO2, which is under the tab Opportunities.
Yes.
Have you got that?
Yes.
And can you see there that SEO2 is described as ensuring that the remnant areas of biodiversity-rich chalk grassland are retained and managed to ensure good condition, seek opportunities to restore areas in poor condition, and extend the area of this habitat, and then talks about historic features. Yeah?
Yes.
And with that observed, can we go on in the same document to page 55? And forgive me, madam, I have no idea what these are electronically. I'm just using the hard copy internal pagination of the document. It's page 55.
They're the same, Mr. Boyle. I'm looking at an electronic copy.
That's very helpful. This is under the tab Analysis, and the little subheading is Biodiversity.
Yes.
You got that? And again, under the heading Opportunities, you take your eye to that.
Yes.
And can we see there the third entry for opportunities is encourage where appropriate the reversion of arable land to chalk grassland, particularly on steep slopes and valley sides.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Now, just as we've touched on the common ground for the built form being in keeping with the character, no part, as I understand, of your evidence, the inspector, has been to object to the proposal for grassland or additional woodland planting on the balance of the site, the 6.25 hectares.
No, that's right. I haven't objected to that activity per se. I believe I said earlier it doesn't necessarily need to be facilitated by 75 dwellings, but those particular elements I don't object to.
I'm very grateful. I mean, because you doubtless have had experience, there are times when it's suggested that the green proposals of a scheme are in some way objectionable in character terms, but that's not the case here, is it?
No, that's right. I expressed concern as to the creation of public open space so close to dwellings adjacent to the green lanes and the effect on the character and tranquility of the green lanes. And I'm sure we'll discuss the visual effects of screening certain views to the AONB later on. Those are the only 2 points I consider of relevance in relation to your question.
Thank you very much. But certainly in terms of the proposal to have, rather than arable fields, to have grassland and or woodland and or orchards as a landscape character point, that is not being objected to by the authority.
That's correct.
Good, that's very helpful. Thank you. Then I say you should now be, you can put away the A4 appendices, that's volume 1 for the time being. You should now be still, I hope, at Appendix 15 on the A3 version, the HCA and the National.
Yes.
Yeah. Turn the page or click the next page. We get to the local character area. Local character
Is that Appendix 17?
Yeah. Trouble is, I have to dot backwards and forwards even in my hard copy.
I'm sure it is because the
yes,
header on the PDF I'm looking
7.
at says it. So
thank you. Appendix 17. Got it?
Yes. Titled Allocations and Local Landscape Character.
That's it. This is the Basingstoke and Dean LCA. And again, it does the usual thing. It divides the area into character areas and then divides them separately into character types.
Yes.
And if we identify where we are, it's the buffy colour, semi-enclosed chalk and clay farmland C3 is our character type.
Yes.
And the South Test Downs is our character area, number 13.
Yes.
Yeah, and we can see, because we're now at a finer grain, we can see, can't we, how the valley is treated differently with the valley floor. You got that?
Yes.
Open valley floor, enclosed valley floor, and then rising up beyond the railway line. Do you remember that's the demarcation of the AONB? We get the yellow, which is open arable.
That's right. Yes, it possesses a more open character.
As well as I think the pinky colour open valley sides.
Yes.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. So that's the local landscape character area. We can see there, I hope, the allocation which then subsequently became, at J, subsequently became 7 acres.
Yes.
Extending the urban area. It, of course, now is part of the urban area, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And it would be therefore washed over, presumably with the sort of browny colour, grey-brown colour.
Yes.
Mushroom, perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah. As would the 2 development parcels if the inspector were to be minded to grant this permission and this exercise was to be done again, the LC exercise, doubtless they would be too.
Yes.
Yes. The balance, however, of course, being open would remain the buff colour, the C3 semi-enclosed chalk and clay farmland.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, that's helpful. Good, thank you. Now, I'm going to skip on. Don't lose that. So keep it if you can. Keep a bookmark tab on that appendix 17. But I want to skip on to the grain drawings, which you'll find at appendix 20.
Yes.
You have that, and if you have the first one, that's with 7 acres in place.
Yes.
Got that? And then the second one with the appeal proposal added in as well.
I see. Yes. 19 and 20. Yes.
Yeah. And again, important caveat, obviously this is based on an illustrative scheme. We read in automatically the caveats we put in beforehand, but it's capable of being developed in this way, which we've accepted. Yeah.
Yes.
And we can see how the grain then relates to the rest of the village, including the adjacent development. And although you didn't have necessarily this exercise in front of you when you wrote your proof, it accords, doesn't it, with the observation that I took you to a moment ago, that in built form terms, it's not out of keeping with the adjacent settlement, including, of course, 7 acres.
Yes, the perimeter block type layout expressed by this does seem to be consistent with the adjacent areas.
Yeah, and the densities that we discussed, if you do the maths.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. Good. Right, now, the next plan in the sequence you should find is the viewpoint location plan.
Yes.
And here, I need you to, at the same time, have your own proof appendices out.
Okay.
If I go within your appendices to, I think it's Appendix 3, you give us a series of photographs, starting with the layout plan, helpfully, on an OS base. Do you have that?
Yes.
And just again, for orientation purposes at this stage, we can see the site. We know the sunken lane of the north. We have the sunken lane on the west, and we have what we're calling the farm track, where your viewpoint 7 is shown.
Yes.
Yeah. So those are the immediately adjacent public rights of way. You yourself show no viewpoints from the northern sunken lane, but we have views 16 and 3 within the appellant's evidence.
Yes, that's right. When I surveyed the mud track in the height of summer, there wasn't sufficient visibility into the site to be able to take a clear photograph. So I know the inspector had the benefit of extensive photographs from the appellant's side. So I felt I've only sought in my proof to include what I would call positive views.
Views where you can see something.
Where views that are likely to be significantly impacted or have the potential to be. So.
All right.
Yes,
Okay.
I haven't. I figured if I also include a raft of negative views, if it's already been captured by the appellant, a photograph is a photograph. They won't normally change from a location. So, in the interest of keeping my evidence brief for the benefit of the inspector.
Okay. Well, we have what we have. There are no photographs from you on the northern sunken lane. Along the alignment of the western sunken lane, you have a series of photographs. We'll look at those in a moment, as does the appellant. We'll look at those in a moment. And then it's photos 18 and 17 from the farm track, and your 7.
Yes, which more or less corresponds with 17.
It does, yes. Thank you very much. Now, in terms of the AONB, your photos don't extend as far as that, but for the AONB, we have for the appellant's sheet, if you have that, 21, 22, 20, and 24.
Yes.
You see those? So we'll look at those in a moment as well. Okay. Good, that's very helpful. Now, what I'm going to do, unusually for me, is start, if I may, with the visual impact assessment that you've undertaken, and then we'll go and look at character. Okay, so as you indicated in your evidence chief, it's section 5, which is the baseline, and then section 6 is where you do the assessment.
Yes.
And you've identified at 6.3 or page 32 the visual receptors which you've chosen to assess.
Yes.
Yeah. And the executor will just have to forgive me for a moment if we go over well-travelled ground. Both you and Mr. Cook have used the current Glivia guidance as the basis of your methodology. Both of you set out your methodologies as required in the appendices, and in very broad terms, the structure of that methodology, and hence your from the guidance, is that for a given receptor, and here we're dealing with visual, say it's people experiencing a view at a location. Yeah.
Yes.
For a given receptor, you need to first of all assess the sensitivity of that receptor, and there are criteria against which the methodology does that. You then assess the magnitude of change to the view, in this case, because we're visual, the view experienced by that receptor.
Yes.
Yeah? And then that gives you a relationship which provides the magnitude, not magnitude, gives you the significance of effect upon that receptor.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's the 3-stage process. We know, so we don't take time over it, it's not a mechanistic exercise, it's not a mathematical exercise, it involves necessarily judgment, but the whole purpose of the exercise is to add some degree of transparency to the judgment so that others can explore it, see if they agree with it, and indeed, for that matter, cross-examine on it.
That's right. Yes, it's incumbent upon the individual assessors to align with the broad structure within the guidance, but also to set out a clear methodology that explains the decision-making process they've undertaken, and to undertake that process in such a transparent manner that, as you say, somebody attempting to follow that assessment can understand how they came to the judgments that they've made. That's
very helpful. And then, of course, we pull the rug under the whole thing by saying the inspector will go out and take her own view in due course, having experienced it on site.
Indeed, she will, such is the subjective nature of landscape and visual.
but hopefully informed by the experts, otherwise we're all wasting our clients' money on the subject.
Right.
Now, in that exercise, and that's a very helpful agreement as to how the process works. In that exercise, we recognize, don't we, that the receptors themselves are, as it were, notional. They're not real, actual people. They're users or whatever, objectively looking at a particular site.
Yes, receptors are generally either representative, which is a more specific capturing of an experience, or illustrative, which can be, for example, reverse views as well, to make your best estimate if, for example, you can't access a particular piece of land or something like that.
Thank you. So I say they're not actual people, so they're different from a local resident's objection. I feel this. It's an assessment by you. This is how the user would experience a change.
That's right, and it's to do with the material change in the view more than the perceptual reaction to that view in a visual assessment.
That's very helpful, because the other point I just come to, and we'll deal with it and then come back to where we were, that all views are kinetic, and the fact that you have to take a fixed photo for purpose of a proof it mustn't stop the inspector from actually walking and experiencing the route, if it's a route, or the location, and turning her head this way and yon.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes,
And
and we can only do our best with photography to capture that moment. But again, it's at a fixed moment in time, and especially with landscape, it changes throughout the year, let alone year to year.
And that gives, doesn't it, that recognition gives the proper context in which even a visual impact is to be experienced, because there's the rest of the 360 around behind you.
Yes, that's right. We can only approximate the field of view of the human eye, and yes, especially with summer views, it's important to take those with a certain pinch of salt. That that is the best scenario presented in terms of visual screening from vegetation.
Yes, to say best scenario for visual screening, that can flip the other way, can't it? Because in winter, you may have views which have a greater degree of context in terms of built form, whereas in summer, the existing built form is more obscured by vegetation than at other times of the year.
Yes, that's true.
That's good. Now, the point at which I want to come back to was that, again, in terms of the material change in the view, one of the aspects, and we see it through the criteria, is the extent to which there is, yes, a change, but the character of the view fundamentally doesn't alter. That is, it doesn't alter in its fundamentals.
It depends on the magnitude of change.
Yeah, but it also in terms of the nature of the change, doesn't it?
Could you ask again? I don't follow that. Sorry.
Whether there is a material change depends on whether the fundamentals of the view are altered, even though there may be an actual change in the view, whether the nature and character of that change is fundamentally altered.
Yes, that's right, and that's generally expressed in the stages of magnitude of change assessment. So, for example, a low magnitude of change might be what we might call introducing a minor element into a view, going up to something which is prominent within a view, up to the highest level of change where something would make a fundamental alteration to the view.
Yeah, but the point I accept all of that, and I agree we're on the same page as far as that's concerned. The point I'm on is also the nature of the change. So something may be prominent, but characteristic of the existing view. And therefore, although there is plainly a change in the view, it's not a material change to how the view is, as it were, appreciated, because the character of the view is
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, because something which is in existence in a view but becomes far more prominent would affect how that view is appreciated. So this, I presume this is in the realm of context in terms of the view. And yes, whilst, for example, a completely uninterrupted view is likely to experience a greater magnitude of change with the introduction of built elements to a landscape where no built elements are present. Nonetheless, if built elements are either larger or closer or something like that, then even though there's already that degree of precedent within the view, there's still plenty of scope for harm.
Well, let's just look at your table 7 in your appendix in that case, see if we can put this point to agreement.
Could you just help me with the page number, please?
In my version, madam, it's called page 16 of 18, and it's appendix, I think it's appendix 1.
Yeah.
Appendix 2.
Forgive me, appendix 2.
In the combined PDF, it would be page 58.
Yep, got it, thank you.
Are you there, Mr. Dudley?
Yes.
It's paragraph 5.4 and the series of bullet points below. You got that?
Yes.
And if you look through those paragraphs, what you'll see repeatedly is the nature of the change as well as the scale of the change.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's reflecting the point that I hope you and I will therefore be able to agree that it's not just the size or prominence, but also the nature of the change in the view, which is relevant given the context.
Yes.
Good, that's helpful. Now, forgive me for taking time with that. Let's go back to section 6 where you have the appraisal.
Okay.
And 6.3 sets out the 5 visual receptors we've chosen.
Yes.
And I won't take these in order because I want to start, if I may, with what's called the users of Turrell Hill Road.
Yes.
Yeah. And if we remember our orientation exercise, that is what I call the sunken track that runs along the west of the development site, repeal site.
That's correct.
Yeah, okay. Now, if I then identify where your relevant photos are for that, it's within your appendices. Are you there? It's
Yes.
4, 5, and 6, isn't it?
Correct.
And do you still have the, well, I'm going to go to the parameters plan, so as not to have any of the further negatives, but the parameters plan, which was Appendix 11 of Mr. Cook's appendices.
Yes.
And we'll do it in the order traveling as if we were traveling from the south. Yeah.
Yep.
That's helpful. So photo 4 first then, therefore, please.
Yes.
Photo 4, if I look at the legend on your layout plan, you have that?
Yes.
Is in fact on the edge of the field, isn't it, rather than in the sunken lane?
Yes. Well, there was a patch of seasonal vegetation in that location, and so I took the photo in front of the seasonal vegetation as opposed to behind it, to illustrate the level of visibility.
Yeah. To do so, what you did was you went into the field to take the photo, which you have at view 4.
You can see on the left-hand side of the view, it's sort of on the edge of the alignment of the vegetation, but the inspector will see that, no doubt, when she visits that location, the context in which it was taken.
That's absolutely right, but we need to be abundantly clear here. When we're talking about impact on the sunken lane, which is Turrell Hill Road, Turrell Hill Lane, that photo at 4 is in fact not on the lane, it's in the field adjacent to the lane.
It was taken on the boundary between the two, as shown by the vegetation to the left.
Okay, and the equivalent to it in the appellant's photographs would be, can you find the drawing? It's photo 7.
Yes.
Yeah, and if you turn up photo 7, you have that?
Yes.
That's actually from the lane, isn't it?
Yes, that's right, and that's the patch of seasonal vegetation that I was just alluding to.
Thank you very much. Now, in both of those, or to a lesser or greater extent, we see the existing 7 acres development popping up above its own cluster of trees.
Yes.
Yeah. And it is, so in relation to that development, as we've established, that the appeal proposal would not be out of keeping with the character. Yeah.
Architecturally, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. If we then take our journey forward northwards, so we're now in photo viewpoint 5. Yeah.
Yes.
Your photo viewpoint 5. Now, again, if I look at your legend, the location on the map would appear to be just outside the appeal site to the south of it, and it's meant to be showing the view from the sunken lane. If I take the photo viewpoint 5 photograph, again, what I find, and the inspector will be able to do so herself, is that you've stepped off the sunken lane and into the appeal site within the appeal site itself.
Again,
Yes.
this was taken from the boundary between the two.
Well, from where the photograph is actually taken, we can see in photograph 5, you're within the field, aren't you?
The field is in the foreground, but as you say, the view is looking forward. So I believe I was standing on the transition at that point, but looking forward into the field. So the field occupies the full width of view.
Well, again, you have left the sunken lane in order to obtain this view. So when we're, again, thinking about this as a visual receptor, which is users of the lane, yes, if the users of the lane leave the lane, they might choose to get this view. But if they are on the lane as users of the lane, that's not the view they get, is it?
If they were in the core of the lane, no, that's right. But there is a clear gap where the desire line meets the lane.
Well, remember that.
And so I was standing within that gap.
That desire line, as we know, is a trespass line, isn't it?
It is. Yes, although there is a proposal within the submitted plan, the parameters plan, I believe, to have a permanent gap in that location.
Yes, indeed. But what we're trying to assess is the impact on users of an existing lawful right of way. If we were to seek a view from within the sunken lane itself at that point, can you turn back to the appellant's plan? And it's this time photo 6.
Yes.
Do you see that? Photo 6, if you turn up photo 6, viewpoint 6 for me.
Yes.
You've got that? That's from within the lane itself. Yes. And again, what we're going to see from there is, because this time we're looking across the edge of the adjacent field, we see 7 acres amongst its trees.
Yes, viewpoint 6 is from a gap slightly further to the south by the look of it.
Okay, and then just to complete the point, if you still have the parameters plan or ideally the illustrative layout plan, from the appellant's viewpoint 6, there is to the, I'm going to call it the left-hand side of that photograph, there is the proposed new planting block between the viewer and the development area.
Yes.
Yeah. But again, always in the context of the existing settlement, which we see there in the photograph that we've got at viewpoint 6.
That's right. Yes, the existing settlement is consistently present beyond the site.
That's very helpful. Good. And then again, if you wouldn't mind going to your plans and your legend at item viewpoint 6, you travel north.
Yes.
Viewpoint 6, have you got that?
Yes.
Viewpoint to reach viewpoint 6, one's traveled from 5, presumably along the path as opposed to the sunken path as opposed to within the site.
Correct.
And one gets to viewpoint 6. If I turn up your viewpoint 6, do you have that?
Yes.
Again, what you've done is left the path, gone into the field, and taken a shot across the field.
I've stood again at the edge of the sunken lane corridor.
Good.
So I'm basically standing between the sunken lane and the field.
That's very helpful. Between the sunken lanes, because I mean, I may say, Mr. Dudley, there's nothing wrong with taking photographs for visual impact across the site itself. We've done that ourselves. What we have to understand, and the inspector needs to recognise, though, is when she's assessing the impact on a specific receptor, and that is a user of a public right-of-way, she needs to be looking at the impact on the user of the public right-of-way, not if they divert away from the public right-of-way and take another view somewhere else. Otherwise, she won't be getting the assessment right, will she?
Yes, that's correct. And I mean, certainly in this context, I would invite the inspector to walk that route and to examine those images in their context, because as you previously said, I think that is very, very important to appreciate. What I've sought to do here is to simulate the availability of views through the existing gaps that exist through the boundary of the sunken lane. But yeah, I would
No,
invite the inspector.
let's be precise about it. What you have illustrated is views if you leave, that you are no longer a user of Turrell Hill Road, you've left it and you've gone onto the site. Yeah, and that's what the inspector needs to be aware of.
It's where gaps exist into the site from Turrell Hill Road.
The point being exemplified, if we look to the, again, the appellant's photos and the northern Sunken Lane, by photographs 3 and 16. Can you find those for me?
Yes.
Mr. Boyle, can you just give me the appendix reference number again? Because I've got so many up now.
It's 22, madam, if that helps.
22,
I have the electronic
helpful,
copy.
And it's photos 3, madam, and 16.
Just taking a moment to load. Okay, I have them now. Thank you.
I'm grateful. Because it's right, isn't it, that when you're actually in the sunken lanes themselves, they are, as they say on the tin, they're sunken. And they are, I think I described it in at some stages, they're heavily embowered. Yes, they are embowered by the vegetation on either side of the sunken lane. And if you look at, for example, at photos 3A and 3B, you and I have both walked these routes, and the inspector may have and certainly will do. It is that sense of enclosure that one gets, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. The key difference between the northern and the western lane is that the desire line gaps don't occur in the northern boundary. There are none. Hence, as I said before, I whilst I have taken photographs along that route, I haven't submitted them with my proof because I didn't perceive that there was a positive enough view, it's certainly in the summer context, to see into the site. And so I haven't submitted the users of that route as a visual receptor, because I think based upon that and based upon the layout given within the parameter plan, I don't think there is the potential for significant impact on the users of that route.
I'm grateful, because the same then is true, isn't it, in terms of the north-south axis, that is the Turrell Hill Road sunken lane, that if you remain on it, and let's look please at photograph 4, photograph 4,
yes,
if you remain on it, what you get is the same enclosed, embowered environment, not visually affected by the proposal. Yeah.
You do, apart from where the gaps exist to the south of the area of scrub.
We have at photo viewpoint 5 a gap, but remaining within the sunken lane as opposed to straying beyond it. There's the view photo 5. Of course, we have to remember that under the proposal, photo 5 has planting open space, and then you can see where the angle of the arrow is, the existing settlement edge marked residential development within Overton.
Yes.
Yes. So again, when assessing the receptor chosen, which is users of Turrell Hill Road, the inspector needs, doesn't she, to always bear in mind their actual experience along the route, as opposed to straying off route through what is currently trespass lines. Yeah?
Yes, that's right. She needs to consider the experience from the width of the public highway.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to turn away from those two sunken lanes and go, please, to what we call the access, the farm track, which is your view 7 and the appellant's views 18 and 17. And the text we pick up at your 620 to 623. You have that?
Just turn my text up, please. Yes.
Excellent. Now, your view 7 is taken at the field gate, which is the appellant's view 17.
Yes.
And we can see across the field, which is out with the appeal site, and that line of green in your view 7 is the vegetation on either side of the it's the Sunken Lane we've just been looking at. Yeah.
Yes.
Together with, on the right-hand side, you've helpfully shown Jackson's Copse, which is off to the south and, to our version, the right of the view.
Yes, that's right.
And then it must be in the sort of centre of the view, the area of previous workings which are outside the appeal site but are have grown up subsequently. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. The hedgerow on the left-hand side of appellant's view 17 is quite useful. If you see the hedgerow that runs along the left-hand side of view 17,
yes,
where that meets Turrell Hill Road, marks roughly the centre of the area of scrub, if you look at it from the aerial photograph.
Yeah, that's helpful. Now, you very fairly make the point, in summertime, you see this extent of green screening. In wintertime, you may not.
Yes.
Yes.
The screening effect would be diminished.
Thank you. You also make the point that, of course, the thickness of any area of planting decreases as one gets to the very top of it.
Yes.
Yeah? So the twigs at the top are less effective than the bulk at the bottom.
Well, it depends on the nature of the vegetation, but in this particular case, yes.
Yeah, that's very helpful. We know from the layout where the proposed development areas are and their relationship with the existing settlement, including the new 7 acres. Yeah.
Yes.
And what we don't have from you is an assessment of whether in winter, the extent to which one would see the existing development, including 7 acres, in this viewpoint.
That's right. Yes, I naturally wasn't able to take winter views.
Thank you. And as I understand it, the highest you put the point is that in the future, there may be the upper parts of some of the proposed dwellings appearing, as it were, through the tops of these trees.
Yes, I mean, as we said, the proposal is for 10-metre high dwellings, 130 metres closer to the receptor than the existing urban edge. And I believe the majority of the scrub along that route was measured at 5 metres in height. With occasional taller trees along the route.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to chase that down with you. Can we pick up?
It's in the tree.
But the point
it's in the tree report.
That's as high as you put your case, isn't it? That there may be in the winter some glimpses of upper parts of the properties from this point 7, which is the field gate.
That's right. It would likely be rooftops, possibly the upper parts of the taller dwellings.
That's very helpful.
Depending on alignment.
And it is, isn't it, along this route only that field gate, because the hedge, it isn't strictly a sunken lane, I think, the farm track, but the hedge is taller than any person or any vehicle travelling along that route.
Yes, well, there's also the gap where viewpoint 18 was taken, so it's likely that there would be a similar degree of visibility on the oblique view.
Well,
across there.
In that case, let's look at viewpoint 18. You've got that? Viewpoint 18
yes.
Looks, and again, you've got the hedge line, I hope.
Yes.
So you can orientate yourself, and those large oak trees, they look like. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. There's a domed tree towards the right-hand side of the view. So it's I would anticipate to the right of that.
Good, because to the left, that's where the land drops away down towards Pond Close, isn't it?
That's right. The northern parcel of the proposed scheme, I do not think would be visible. It would be the southern parcel on the more elevated land.
Thank you. And it's the southern parcel, of course, which is then adjacent to the existing development with which you say it is in keeping.
Architecturally, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good. Well, you say architecturally, you've made that comment before. You don't suggest any other way it's out of keeping with the adjacent development in terms of density, arrangement, alignment, anything of that nature?
No, my contention is settlement form.
No, okay, that's fine. Well, we looked at the grain plan before. Thank you very much indeed. That's the track. Thank you. Then back to your text, please. So section 6.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you just help me with this? You've got two different users of Pond Close. You've got the residents who live in Ponds Close, and then you've got the users of Ponds Close. I'm assuming that is the highway, which is Ponds Close.
Correct.
Yeah. And so if we just start with the second, you've essentially used, I think, the same visual illustrators, that's views 1 and 2, to show the difference, or to show the point. Because we can see, can't we, that what you're doing is you're standing next to the chain link fence and the metal gate at the end of that sort of turning point.
That's right, yes. Both images taken from the same location.
Yeah. And that's presumably because you didn't have access to individual residents' houses and gardens, and so this is a proxy for those nearby residential dwellings.
Correct, that's right. It's a representation of the view from the Pond Close public highway, and it's an illustration of the view from essentially all of the exposed dwellings on the eastern side. And as witness rightly pointed out this morning, that would also include now the new residents of the existing dwellings at 7 acres.
Yes, thank you very much. Now, just as a matter of principle, we can agree, can't we, that a significant strategy nationally in terms of achieving additional dwellings as required is that sustainable areas, urban areas, be extended. Yeah?
Yes.
You'll be familiar with that.
I am.
And
yes.
As night follows day, if you're going to extend an existing urban area, the edge that is being extended ceases to be on the edge and becomes within the settlement.
Yes.
And so it would be self-defeating, wouldn't it, if at each stage it was an objection that those who currently enjoy a view over a field won't do, because they'll be viewing over the next accepted part of the development.
Yes, that's right. Although that equally doesn't apply as automatic justification for a site. So it's a element of the wider planning balance consideration.
Thank you. I'm not saying it's a justification,
but
it's not an objection to the site that the existing settlement boundary will have to move out and cease to be settlement boundary because it's now subsumed within the development. Yeah.
In visual terms, yes. As you know, I've made raised a concern regarding a long established and logical western settlement boundary and extending the settlement further west than it has been in the past, but that strays us into landscape matters. So
thank you very much indeed. Thank you. With that context in mind, can I just then take you to your text at 610 in terms of the users of Pond Close, and have at the same time the views 1 and 2?
Yes.
What we there have is, having assessed the low sensitivity of these people as visual receptors, 610 gives us the finding of magnitude in terms of the change.
Yes.
And the way it's described is a new combination of new residential dwellings and public open space in this view, altering its character and shortening the view. Given the existing residential context, the magnitude is low.
Yes, that's right. This brings in, of course, in visual judgments, considering the activity that's being undertaken as part of the visual receptor. And so generally people going from A to B, going about their general business in the street, is inherently considered to be a lower sensitivity receptor than people's private views from a dwelling.
Forgive me, I'm not on sensitivity, I'm a question of magnitude. Yeah? Magnitude you found is low. We don't dispute that for a second, but it's low because of, first of all, taking into account the proposal, which you describe in the first sentence of 610, and then the existing residential context.
Yes, there's a gap in the parameters plan in that location, and the view is framed by existing dwellings. I mean, yes, the viewpoint was taken from the very end of Pond Close, but of course, the users of Pond Close will be experiencing a view that steadily opens as they move along westwards along Pond Close. And so for the majority of the route there will be the 1960s dwellings within that view, hence finding a low magnitude of change.
Thank you very much. And it's picking up the point that we agreed a long time ago that you need to take into the context. Take that into account when you're assessing the magnitude of change. And it's the 360-degree context rather than just the view cone context. Yeah?
Yes.
And you rightly, therefore, you come to a magnitude of change which is low. Yes?
Yes.
Now, when in contrast, I looked at your text at 6.4 to 6.7, obviously the sensitivity is different because you're dealing with a different nature of receptor.
Yes.
Albeit the inspector has in her mind the points we've agreed. These are private views, not public views, and they're in the context of the inevitability of existing edges moving out and becoming subsumed within new development. But I'm on magnitude, which is 660. Yeah.
Yes.
Because we're in the same broad location, we have the same context, namely the 1960s, 70s development.
I wouldn't agree with that because the views from the properties look directly out into the countryside. They don't have, as from what I could tell without being in the individual properties, the oblique views of dwellings and such. They don't move along a framed view towards the site. They're located with clear primary views out across the site into the countryside.
Sorry to cut you off. What are they viewing out from, Mr. Dudley?
They're viewing out from their dwellings, yes, but
exactly. What is a more profound residential context than sitting in the house itself from the 1960s, 1970s?
But in terms of the nature of their outlook, that doesn't have those built elements within it. And that's why the guidance saw fit to allocate the highest level of sensitivity to those receptors.
I'm on magnitude. I'm not on sensitivity. I'm not fighting on sensitivity because I understand, albeit we've set the context now. I understand the sensitivity. The magnitude, the context of the view obtained is from the very 1960s, 1970s development, which in 6.8 to 6.10 is recognized as giving a low magnitude of change. Yeah.
For those moving along Pond Close.
Yes.
Through a corridor of dwellings. And in my view, that experience is fundamentally different to what I judge there to be an uninterrupted countryside view, and introducing built elements are very close to, if you took a view out of a window of one of those dwellings and then introduce the proposal into it, you can't be arguing that it's not going to fundamentally alter that view.
The context is existing residential, surely, because it's out of existing residential house. Yes.
The nature of the view, though, is uninterrupted countryside, which is what I've assessed.
The context, because the same could be said of 6.10. The context is what we see in 6.10, namely existing residential by definition. It's from a house.
I disagree. Those existing residents looking out of their dwellings would not see the adjacent dwellings. It's not a framed view. They're not looking between further dwellings towards the site. They're looking directly out into the site.
But we've already
agreed. I understand the point. I think I understand the point that you're making.
Thank you very much.
To this, and clearly I will take both viewpoints into account when I go to have a look at that.
Thank you, madam.
Thank you very much, madam. Good. Let's leave visual behind. There's your visual reception. Turn to character, please. and see if we can deal with this relatively quickly. Do you remember we started by looking at the reason for refusal?
Yes.
And the reason for refusal says that the scheme, by virtue of its location and size, would significantly impact on the setting of the village of Overton. Yeah, adversely impacting on the local landscape character and scenic quality. Yeah, so it's the setting of the village of Overton, and harm to that setting by virtue of development would adversely impact on the local landscape character and scenic quality. Yeah, that's the allegation.
It is.
Let's then turn to your section 4, please. And we just run through the various character receptors you've identified. You helpfully set them out actually on the previous page. It's paragraph 341.
Yes.
You have that?
Yes.
If I go through those headings, it's fair to say, isn't it, that not one of them concerns itself with the setting of the settlement, setting of the village of Overton.
I disagree. These are all physical and perceptual elements which give rise to the setting of the village.
Well, would you like to identify which of them you consider to be to do with the setting of the village as an assessment, please?
They all contribute to the character of the settlement, the setting of the village, whether it's the open arable character of the site, which separates it from the sunken green lanes and lends them their tranquil character as interesting elements within that setting, whether it's the relationship with the settlement edge and how the settlement interfaces with its surrounding countryside, and then how the settlement relates to the opposing valley side to which it's exposed.
Can I take you to what you've actually said, as opposed to what you're telling me now? Paragraph 341, you'll propose that the characteristics of the site and its setting is what you then assess.
Yes.
Yeah? And that is, in truth, what you then do within those 6 individual landscape character receptors. You're assessing the characteristics of the site and the setting of the site, aren't you?
Because the site forms the setting to the village in this location.
You would need to then extrapolate further and establish what out of those 6 characters then directs itself to the reason for refusal, which is not an exercise you do for the inspector, is it?
Not specifically. No, I look at, as I said, the site, because the site itself in this context is the setting to the village.
Okay, let's
the site
then
and
look,
its immediately adjacent land uses.
Let's then look at the points individually. I'm going to start again, not in order, but take the last one first. The overall character setting of the site. Yeah?
Yeah.
It starts at your 432.
Yeah.
And the first question, of course, is what is the concept we're here grappling with? You appreciate that one has an object, in this case, the development site, and one has the setting of that object. Yeah?
Yes.
Am I to understand these paragraphs as assessing the setting of the object, namely the site, or the site itself?
It's both. It's the site as the immediate setting to the village, and then looking at the wider context and how the site relates to that wider context.
No. The setting of the site comprises 3 elements: the village, Test Valley, and we're told now the AONB. So what we're actually grappling with here is the setting of the site, aren't we?
Yes, which is on the edge of the village and inherently forms the setting of the village, which comes back to the original objection of the landscape officer.
Oh no, because what we then see is allegations of harm to the setting by development on the site. Yes?
Yes, by extending the village into its setting, it's causing harm to the wider setting.
Well, let's again focus on the concept we're dealing with. This section here, this landscape receptor, isn't the site, it's the setting of the site. isn't it? That's what your landscape receptor is here.
Yes.
Just like the visual receptor wasn't people who'd strayed off the path, it was the users on the path. The landscape receptor here is not the site, it's the setting of the site.
It's the wider landscape context of the site.
Thank you. The reason for refusal, of course, doesn't allege harm to the setting of the site, as we've just identified. Correct?
I disagree, because this all comes under the banner of the setting of the village of Overton. The village of Overton sits within a much wider landscape context. The site is within the immediate setting of the village. It's the area of land under consideration, and then the broader landscape setting is the setting to the combination of the site and the village which it would extend.
You see, that's the point where we would like you to have assessed. If you go back to, let's just give a nice example. Appendix, Mr. Cook's appendices, Appendix 17. Because there's the village. Yeah?
Yes.
And if you were to do an assessment which accords with the reason for refusal, you would need to look at the setting of the village. So there's the village. You assess what is the setting of the village. And for our purposes on this plan, the district character area identifies different character types and different character areas. You would need to assess the role that the site plays within that setting, remembering that it's only a proportion of the site which is proposed for development and the rest for unobjectionable green uses. And you'd need to assess how, if at all, that contribution is altered by the proposal adversely, seek to quantify it in the Glivier manner, and give the inspector assistance in her determination. Now, you haven't assessed the setting of the village as a whole and the role of the appeal site in it, have you?
Yes, I've used an assessment of the site and its setting as a proxy for looking at the setting of the village.
Well, but that doesn't work, does it? Because if you look at the site, the red line, what the conceptual receptor is at 432 is not the setting of the village, it's the setting of the red area. And what you're assessing is the impact on the setting, not of the village, but on the setting of the red area, haven't you?
Yes, but I would argue in this context, they're one and the same.
Well, you know that's not the case, Mr. Dudley, because a moment ago you just accepted the setting of the village is much wider, isn't it? It's everything we can see on this plan.
Yes.
Yes, good. Now,
the village has its setting, how it sits in the wider landscape, and that's part of the setting of the site. The site, as I've said, the site is the immediate setting of the village to the west. The site would become part of the village, as we have identified earlier, becoming grey washed over. And so the wider setting of the site comprises, in this context, the wider setting of the village.
No, Mr. Dudley, not at all. You know perfectly well the site is part of the setting of the village. Yes? It's part of the setting of the village. It is not the setting of the village. And the setting of the site is not the setting of the village. The setting of the site is the setting of the site. Yes?
Which also forms the wider setting of the village, because the site is adjacent to the village. It must, because the site is adjacent to the village.
It doesn't form the wider setting of the village. As we can see, Overton Mill, Foxdown, Quidhampton, Bart Farm, those are not part of the setting of the site, but they are part of the setting of the village, aren't they?
Yes, they are part of the eastern setting of the village.
Thank you very much. Now, just the next stage. in this exercise, please. Do you remember in the context of visual, we described how LVIAs work for the sensitivity of the receptor, the magnitude of change, and then that gives us an assessment of the significance of the impact. Yeah?
Yeah.
Now, critical to those stages, you would agree, Mr. Dudley, are understanding the scale at which one has identified the landscape, in this case, the landscape receptor in question. Yeah? That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
Because unless we know how big the landscape receptor is, firstly, we don't know over what area we are going to be assessing its value and susceptibility and hence its sensitivity, because areas change in their value and susceptibility and hence sensitivity. Yeah?
Yes.
And secondly, we absolutely won't be able to assess magnitude of change on the appeal site because we don't know the scale at which the receptor is experiencing that.
Yes.
Good. And very simply, the smaller the receptor for the same amount of change on the appeal site, the larger the magnitude, the larger the receptor, concomitantly the small magnitude.
It depends on the nature of change.
It does, but you recognize the point I'm putting to you.
But it's a relevant consideration.
It is. Thank you very much indeed. Now, when I'm dealing with the setting of the settlement, and it's the whole settlement and the whole of its setting, that will give me one context for an assessment of the role of the appeal site. And remember, it's the developed parts of the appeal site, so it's the 3-point-something hectares, in scale compared with that wider setting. Yes?
Yes. Yes, in considering effects on wider setting, I've considered the scale of the development as part of that.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, we know, don't we, that in the assessment you've done at 432 and following, one of the factors which you have given in terms of the high susceptibility of change and also value is the nature of the landscape, including the AONB, which lies, as we know, on the other side of the valley, north of the railway.
Yes, the relationship with the facing valley slopes.
Including the AONB within this receptor has, I therefore say, elevated the susceptibility and value, and by definition, because they feed into the sensitivity of the receptor.
Yes.
Yeah. And so it's only by extending this receptor, because you don't tell us physically what area you're looking at, by extending it north across the valley into the AONB, that you get the high sensitivity. Yes?
Not solely, no. But it's certainly one of the contributions, because as has been seen, the site is exposed to a large area of the AONB. Yeah. There are parts of the AONB 7 kilometers away that the site has a relationship with.
Well, I'm going to come to that in a moment, but just so we recognize, it's by including the AONB that we get the readings that we do within your assessment. Yes?
If I was, well, this comes to the point that every site has to be considered in its own context, but certainly the presence of the AONB on the valley slopes facing the site has elevated its sensitivity in landscape terms.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, that gives the inspector, although she's not defined, a sense of the scale of this receptor in question. Yeah? Doesn't it? But we're now embracing the AONB on the north side of the valley.
Yes.
Yeah? Now we have the concept of the extent to which the AONB will experience any change on the site at all. So do you have Mr. Cook's appendices and back to the visuals? And you remember we picked up that photographs 20, 21, 22, and 24 Our
Appendix
views,
22.
yes, it is, madam. And it's photos, madam, for your note 20, 21, 22, 24. Now, we need to be very careful, obviously, as we do this, that we're not going to confuse visual matters with character matters, but obviously one needs to be able to experience from whatever is the receptor, the change, and from this distance, it's principally going to be in a visual manner. So 20, 21, 22, 24. Do you have those, Mr. Dudley?
Yes, I mean, I would disagree though that it has to be experienced from publicly available viewpoints. That's not the nature of landscape. And in this context, yes, there aren't those specific public viewpoints. Although I believe one of the witnesses this morning mentioned that the site is in fact visible from the Harrowway. So presumably that would have been in winter months, because I didn't find visibility when I surveyed.
No, neither did we.
But you know, the fact that you can see a large area of AONB from the site implies that the reverse would happen, specifically if one is building dwellings of 10 meters height
That, of course,
at
is
the upper part of the site.
That, of course, is a logical fallacy with which Mr. Cook doesn't agree, because he's put the views in, you haven't. You haven't found any more or different. Those are the ones he's found looking back towards the site. Okay?
Yes,
so
from publicly available viewpoints.
Exactly. So what we're doing is looking, because here we're talking apparently about the setting of the site. That's your receptor. So you have to be able to experience the site from its setting. Okay. Now, would you mind taking up, in the light of, I hope you've been able to go through now, have you? 20, 21, 22, 24.
Yes, I don't agree though that the site has to be experienced from publicly available viewpoints in order for a landscape character harm to occur. All
right, well, the inspector will have noted that, but in terms of evidence before her, the only available areas of experience are 20, 21, 22, 24. Can I then take you, please, to your methodology in Appendix 2, I think it is.
Yes.
You have that?
I do.
And remembering that we're dealing with character, so it's landscape receptors, magnitude is dealt with at table 4.
Yes.
Yeah. And what we're looking for is a moderate degree of deterioration or improvement, or constitutes a perceptible change within a landscape. That's a perceptible change to the character of the landscape.
Yes.
Yes. The point we discussed earlier in terms of materiality, something might alter, but what we're interested here is the change of the character of the landscape. That would justify a medium magnitude. Yes.
Yes.
You have already agreed with me, and we looked at your text, in the context of this particular receptor, that the built form is not likely to be out of keeping with the existing village, including its adjacent new development.
Yes.
And also that the unbuilt form, the green area, is not objectionable in landscape character terms.
Yes.
So we have an amalgam of unobjectionable in landscape character terms and not likely to be out of keeping in character terms.
Well,
yes?
I'm not suggesting it's the extension of the settlement, the extension of the mass of the settlement at the upper part of the valley, which is what I've taken objection to. Whether or not it's architecturally similar to the parts of the village adjacent to it, it's nonetheless increasing the settlement mass.
The settlement is also part of this receptor, which is the setting, as you put it, of the site. Yes?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And so when the inspector asks herself against your criteria and against the visuals that have been provided to her at 2021, 22, 24, it's right, isn't it, that in terms of the change to landscape character, there would not be a perceptible change to the landscape character of the receptor, first of all, that being, as you've described it, the whole of the setting of the appeal site.
I wouldn't agree with that because of the exposure to the countryside on the other side. It just so happens that that countryside isn't accessible to the public.
No, I'm not on the accessibility now.
So,
I'm on the character of the receptor. There's no change to the character of the receptor by introducing, the receptor being the setting, by introducing on the appeal site itself activity development which is itself characteristic of the setting of the settlement and its surroundings.
I would disagree because in my view, the site at the upper part of the valley is therefore, excuse the confusing terminology, but part of the setting of the setting. It's a reverse relationship. And so changes on the site will affect the character of the overall setting. Increasing the settlement mass on the upper part of the valley will affect the character of that setting because it's how the settlement sits against that setting.
Yeah, I don't think you're following the point I'm putting to you at all, Mr. Dudley. We've gone through already. The site itself experiences a change which is not out of keeping with the adjacent settlement. That the green area is not objectionable in character terms. The site, the landscape character receptor you've chosen for yourself is not the site, but the setting of the site, which embraces the settlement and the fields beyond, and you tell us the AONB itself. Yeah. When I go to the AONB and seek to experience a perceptible change within the landscape, I know what that means is a perceptible change within the landscape character. Yes.
Yes.
And it's the landscape character of the receptor you've chosen. Yes.
Yes. So one of the suite of receptors that I've chosen.
Yeah, I'm on the one that I'm discussing with you now.
Yes.
To introduce development proposal, which in its two different parts together is either within character or in character terms not objectionable, does not change the character of the receptor, does it?
I disagree on the point of the breaching the settlement boundary and the settlement mass. And as we've already established, whilst I accept that architecturally the proposed development may be in keeping with the adjacent settlement edge, nonetheless, the harm that I've identified is in terms of the increased settlement mass within that setting.
And it needs to be perceptible, this change of landscape character. And it's right, isn't it, that, and you've not put any alternative views in, when one goes and seeks to experience it, to perceive it, in terms of your magnitude criteria, 20, 21, 22, 24 from the AONB, there would not be a perceptible change in landscape character, would there?
A member of the public on publicly accessible routes is unlikely to see it in summer months.
Thank you very much. Well, that's one answer, one response, I should say. Now, the question I put to you, it's right, isn't it, that from the AONB, there wouldn't be a perceptible change in the landscape character, that is the character of the landscape, in the receptor you've chosen?
I disagree. In my view, if a member of the public was in a part of that countryside which is exposed to the site, and therefore perceived that wider setting of their location, then it's like they would perceive the settlement, and they would perceive the site, and then they would perceive the extension, the increase in settlement mass, particularly with the location of tall dwellings at the top of the valley.
Yes, and the receptor is the setting of the site. If what
Yes.
we're doing is making it more characteristic with the adjacent settlement.
Yes, it's
than
will the
than
changes
arable
on
field.
site have an effect on the character of the wider setting? And in my view, it will.
Well, no, setting of the site. If we're making it more characteristic, more like the settlement than the arable field is, then it's not affecting the setting of the site, is it, Mr. Dudley?
It is, because the arable field is a
Yes.
characteristic element of that setting.
Of what? No, it can't be said. Can't think of the concept, Mr. Dudley. This is where we started with this. The arable field isn't any part of the setting of the site. It is the site. Do you see?
Yes, but when
So
it
you
is when
can't-
it's
forgive me. So
it's
you
the relationship
can't-
between the site and its setting.
Thank you very much. By affecting the setting. That's what this receptor is, not the site itself at that point. Yes.
Yes, but the nature of considering the setting of the site of a receptor is by its inherent nature off-site. So there will never be direct impacts upon the setting of the site because it is by nature off-site. It's about
Exactly-
the extent to
exactly
which
so.
the site exerts an influence upon its landscape setting. And in a valley
Yes.
context, a site in a valley context will almost always exert an influence upon the surrounding valley context.
And that's why it must be able to be perceived as a change, not the site, but a change to the character of the setting of the site. This is your choice. I didn't choose it. This is your chosen receptor, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
But that is my definition. That's how I perceive that impact, is the influence of the setting and the potential extension of the setting upon its wider setting.
Would you might just take your eye to the low box for magnitude at table 4?
Yes.
Yeah. And if you still have, I hope, Appendix was it 16 or 17, the locations and local landscape character map.
Yes.
And if you mentally put in the development areas into the red line area, yeah,
Yes.
we can agree, can't we, that the development areas, which is what you're saying, is changing the bulk of the settlement of Overton, is only, on any fair objective basis, a minor component of the landscape which we see on that map at Appendix 17.
I don't think it's correct to consider it in plan view. This is a three-dimensional valley landscape. If the landscape was flat in this context, then it's likely that the findings will be very different. But this is a valley landscape, and so the site is by its nature exposed. It has a very strong relationship with the facing valley, the countryside to which it's exposed.
Well, we've been through 20, 21, 22, 24. The inspector will have to go out and judge the extent to which it's exposed from those viewpoints. But in terms of the quantum, the scale, we're in the concept of magnitude. It is right, isn't it, that the development parcels are only a minor component of the landscape receptor you've chosen to assess at this stage? Yeah, that's the only fair.
If you're talking about comparing square meter by square meter, the site with the settlement or with the entire study area, then in that context, the site is a minor element of the whole study area.
Because I'm assessing it against the scale of the receptor, you see, because that's what we have to do. Yeah. Okay, that's very
yes,
helpful.
but
Now,
geographic scale is only one very minor element of the wider perceptual consideration of landscape effects.
Thank you very much. Now, next
Mr.
point.
Boyle, Mr. Boyle,
Yes,
before you move on to your next point, I'm conscious that we're over the time which you'd allocated. Can I just ask how far, what additional time you think you're going to need to finish a cross-examination, or whether or not it would be appropriate for a short comfort break?
Well, I'm very comfortable to have a break this stage, but I think probably 15 minutes and we'll see this done. So basically to 4 o'clock.
Well, if Mr. Dudley is content to continue till 4 o'clock, we'll take a break then. If not, we'll have a 5-minute break now and then and then resume?
I'm fine to carry on for another 15 minutes, madam.
Okay,
And-
fair enough.
Sorry, Mr. Boyle, I'm being very uncooperative with you.
Not at all, not at all. You've been illuminating. We were on the last of your character receptors. I want to skip back one and go to the relationship with Northern Valley Slopes and North Wessex Down A and B. Yeah.
Yes.
Now we will instantly, of course, see overlap between the two receptors. This one is, as I understand it, more focused on what sits on the other side of the river up the slope.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
whereas
again,
the wider setting also included land to the south and
yeah,
to the west, etc. Yes.
and so I won't repeat the points I put to you in terms of photos 21, 20, 22, 24, etc. But we see the same point coming in terms of the high sensitivity, high value, etc. Because of the A and B. It's right, isn't it, when one looks at the reason for refusal, that no allegation was made by the authority, either in express terms in terms of the allegation or by reference to A and B policies, that there was going to be harm to the A and B by virtue of developing the site if the site were in the setting of the A and B?
Not specifically, no.
Good. You also know, don't you, that local authorities are required under guidance to provide comprehensive, that is complete reasons for refusal, as opposed to short, elusive reasons for refusal.
I'd certainly hope so.
Good. That's very helpful. Thank you. And you're also aware that there is specific national policy in respect of A and B and how one goes about judging impacts upon it.
Yes.
Yeah. Which was not then set out in the council's reason refusal or statement of case.
That's right.
Good. Okay, that's helpful. Can I then go back to again step one to the sunken green lanes on the site boundaries? You got that?
A moment, please. Just making a
It
note.
starts at your 414.
Yes.
Okay. 414, again, you've got high for the sensitivity of these receptors, for it's 417.
Yes.
You have that? We've been through the extent to which you will or won't experience the appeal site from the northern sunken lane. Yeah, and
Visually.
you fairly acknowledge visually. Yes.
We've been through it visually, yes.
In terms of how you're going to experience a relationship between the site and the northern sunken lane, and you fairly acknowledge that there was no point you taking any photographs because there was no such relationship to be shown.
Yeah, in August, the site wasn't significantly visible.
Thank you. Because of the way in which the layout is proposed, even within the parameter plan, the development, that is the built development, is tucked in the hollow away from the sunk lane and across the open space and the planted area.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
And then on the western sunken lane, the what is it called? The Hill Lane.
Terrell Hill Road.
Terrell Hill Road. Again, we've been through the fact that as and when you're staying on the sunk lane itself, the experience is A, if you leave the sunk lane and enter into the appeal site or approach the appeal site off the sunk lane, then you get views of the proposed development. But of course, that, as we've seen, is in the context of the existing development along the Pond Close area and up at 7 acres.
Yes,
Yeah?
that's right.
And again, when we're concerning ourselves now not with visual change, but with character change, there's no direct effect on the lanes themselves or the elements of those lanes, correct?
In terms of the delivery of the development, yes.
Thank you very much indeed. And then in terms of the field which is adjacent to those lanes, but as you say, not experienced from within the lane in the way we've been describing, the proposal in each case will be to have the unobjectionable green development in character terms adjacent to the lane. Yes? Yes? Look at the parameter plan.
Yes, well, it's the parameter plan simply shows the reinforcement of the hedgerow there. I did express concern, I think, in relation to introducing an intensive use such as allotments adjacent to the lanes and the effect on their tranquility. It was that experience of tranquility and separation within the lanes which gave rise to their selection as a landscape receptor, and which is what you've brought up in our discussion on visual matters.
Well, as you said to me at the very beginning of all of this, if reserve matters, something else was sought, then something else could be approved. If you don't want to have allotments in the countryside, then no doubt that can be made plain at reserve matters stage. But it's right, isn't it, that the unobjectionable green element of the scheme, that's 6.25 hectares of the 9-hectare site, is adjacent to the lanes. And then beyond that, the two parcels are, as we've been repeatedly acknowledging between us, not out of keeping with the existing village, which itself borders the field. Yes?
Yes, in terms of its architectural appearance, but the presence of the settlement will be significantly closer. The influence of the settlement on the character of the lanes will be amplified significantly because the settlement will, the built edge on the parameter plan will be within 45 meters of the sunken lane, as opposed to, I think, something in the region of 200 meters or so. It's worth noting the scale on the parameter plan is wrong, by the way, in that respect.
But again, what we're dealing with is not something which is affecting the green lane directly, but rather its setting, and doing so in a way which, because we're in terms of character here, something which is characteristic of the receiving landscape. Yes?
In this context, I wouldn't argue, I wouldn't say that bringing the settlement that close. At the moment, the site performs an important role for the lanes in separating the lane from the settlement, and therefore giving rise to this sense of tranquility and of moving through this sunken lane, which is in the countryside, not as part of the settlement. Whereas by, even in terms of, we talk about the objectionality of the open space proposals within the site, within the specific context of this receptor, then I would say that those the access elements could be objectionable. I've already mentioned about the likelihood that there'll be additional desire line routes, gaps made in the vegetation, greater intensity of activity, which for the character of those lanes, which is that sense of tranquility and isolation, that is the character that would be significantly affected.
What it's giving, Mr. Dudley, is additional open space for public use off the lanes.
And in socio-economic terms, that's a benefit.
Yeah, that would increase the tranquility of the lanes themselves, surely.
I completely disagree. I don't think putting a heavy, what's likely to be a well-used area of public open space adjacent to the lane would increase its tranquility. Quite the opposite. I think it would lead to levels of disturbance. So no, in my view, an area of farmland is far more effective at preserving the tranquility of the lane than an area of public open space. I understand that in planning balance, additional public open space is beneficial, but in specific landscape terms, and certainly through the character lens of the experience of these lanes, it would be harmful.
All right, well, we have to leave things better to judge that. The point I'm putting to you very simply is what you have already said to me in your written text in terms of the development not being out of character with the existing settlement, which of course is already in place. Yeah.
Well, yes, it can be in keeping with character, but that doesn't change the fact that it would affect the tranquility of the lanes. It's a separate matter. It's to do with activity.
We've understood the point. Okay, thank you very much. That then leaves me with only 3 further points. The first is strong relationship with settlement edge. But that only gets a moderate to minor significance because you've got a low sensitivity and a medium magnitude. Yeah, that's your 4.9 to 4.13.
Yes.
And I won't take time up with that. And then the other two are the overall character of the site, which is 4.26 to 4.31, and the open arable land use, which is 4.4 to 4.8. Now,
Yes.
just again, so I can understand for the inspector's benefit, the scale, by the nature of this receptor, the overall character of the site, that is the site itself.
Are you referring to the open arable land use?
No, the overall character of the site.
Oh, yes, that is the site itself, yes.
That is the site itself. And again, even if I were to be proposing development over the entirety of the site, nobody should be very surprised that a development site changes its character as a result of the development proposed when it's greenfield becoming a housing estate.
Yes.
And so a little bit like we were saying about the urban edge extending, if every time it was objectionable that the site became a housing estate as opposed to greenfield, we wouldn't be getting greenfield extensions.
No, that's right. And if this site was an area of unremarkable arable land on the edge of a village, notionally without this network of historic lanes on the outside, without this sense of elevation and openness, without its wider relationships and everything else, then my judgments might be different. But on this particular site, there are qualities that I've identified which are of value.
Well, just be careful what we're doing here, because firstly, we recognize, don't we, between us, it's common ground, this is not a site that falls into paragraph 174A of the MPPF as a, quote, valued landscape.
Yes, that's right.
Secondly, in this receptor, we're not talking about the sunken lanes or the A and B, we're talking about the site and the character of the site.
Yes, but this, equally, there is always an interplay. Landscape does not have hard boundaries. There's always soft boundaries. There's an interplay between characteristics because of the perceptual nature of it. So, for example, I've made note that this site making an important contribution to the character of the sunken lanes. It is the separation from the sunken lanes and the village. And so
let's not then double count our receptors. If you've got sunken lane as a receptor, you've got the site as a receptor. This is the receptor, which is the site, okay? And inevitably, of course, the impact on the site is going to be high because it's the site level, that's the scale at which you're assessing, yes? But what we have to recognize, of course, is that in assessing it, what we're looking at is a site which is going from arable field, which is characteristic of the surrounding area, to green space, and we saw the national encouragement to further grassland, unobjectionable green infrastructure, and development in keeping with the adjacent settlement. Yes, those are the factual matters we've agreed between us.
Yes, I mean, in reality, from what we've heard this morning regarding the quality of green space and green space management, as observed already, that does raise questions as to, you know, the extent to which, I mean, you know, chalk grassland is a rare habitat. And, well, it's not very well, but 7 acres was given planning permission on a certain basis, and we're hearing this morning that about the quality of maintenance and delivery. So, but those are straying well outside of landscape. So I will stop there, Mr. Boyle, before we go any further on that. But
if your authority has an enforcement issue to take up on another site, that's up to them. But we're not dealing with that here.
No, that's fine. I shall hit pause there.
Good, well done. Can I then finish with this, which is the last of the receptors, but the first to identify, the open arable land use 4.4 to 4.8. Yeah.
Yes.
What's the scale of that receptor?
It's site scale.
Again, thank you very much. Because certainly you could not possibly have a high magnitude if what you were embracing was arable land use in the surrounding landscape, could you?
No, that's right. So I've considered elsewhere the contribution the site makes as a wider assemblage
Very
of arable land, but this specifically relates to the land use of the site itself.
I'm grateful. Madam, thank you very much. That's just after 4. Thank you.
Okay, don't worry. I'm going to just suggest a 10-minute break now, and then we will come back. I'll just check whether I've got any outstanding questions that weren't raised in that cross-examination, and then I will come to Ms. Perrett for any re-examination. So if we come back at just 4:10, that will be helpful.
Thank you,
Okay.
Madam.
Thank you.
and the set site. And he said the setting of the site is not the setting of the